Why and our big sad news. Kidnapper's shocking identity. Phyllis and Sharon will never get out of here. The sun had barely begun to set over Genoa City, casting long shadows across the streets, when the unthinkable happened. Phyllis Summers and Sharon Newman, two of the town's most well-known women, found themselves in the clutches of an unknown assailant. Locked away in a dimly lit room in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, they were alone, confused, and terrified. Their captor's identity was a mystery, and the seconds felt like hours as they tried to make sense of their situation. But no one could have predicted the shocking twist that would soon unfold. As the walls closed in on Phyllis and Sharon, secrets long buried were about to surface, and the true mastermind behind the kidnapping was someone no one could have ever imagined. Chapter 1. The Abduction. It all began the night of a charity gala. The entire city seemed to be in high spirits as the event brought together the who's who of Genoa City. Phyllis, always the center of attention, looked stunning in a red gown that hugged her curves. Sharon, ever the picture of grace, wore a classic black dress that turned heads in its own subtle way. The evening was a whirlwind of laughter, champagne, and laughter as old friends and new acquaintances mingled. But the night would soon take a darker turn. As Phyllis and Sharon stood outside, exchanging a few quiet words away from the buzz of the gala, they were approached by two masked figures. Before they could react, they were knocked unconscious and loaded into the back of a van. When they woke up, the world around them was starkly different. Gone was the glamour of the gala, replaced by cold cement walls and the damp smell of decay. The two women were shackled to chairs, their hands bound tightly. Their minds raced as they tried to understand what was happening, but the more they thought, the more questions they had. Who would want to kidnap them? And why? Chapter 2. The Silent Terror. The minutes turned into hours, and Phyllis and Sharon sat in silence, only the sound of their shallow breaths filling the room. Neither woman spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because they were both too terrified to speak. Phyllis was the first to break the silence. Sharon, we have to stay calm. We need to think this through, she whispered, her voice strained. Sharon nodded, her eyes darting around the room. I know, but I have no idea who would do this to us. We don't have any enemies who would go this far, do we? Phyllis shook her head. No, we've had our share of run-ins, but nothing like this. This is something bigger. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside. The figure was clad in all black, their face obscured by a mask. They didn't say a word but walked slowly toward the two women, a sinister energy emanating from them. Phyllis, always the fighter, tried to stand, but her restraints kept her in place. Who are you? What do you want from us? The figure remained silent for a moment, as though considering their response. Finally, they spoke, their voice cold and devoid of any emotion. You'll find out soon enough. The figure turned and left as quickly as they had entered, leaving the two women alone once more. Chapter 3. The Search for Answers. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, the search for Phyllis and Sharon had begun in earnest. Nick Newman and Ray Rosales led the investigation, along with a team of detectives and forensic experts. The abduction had made headlines, and the entire town was on edge. Everyone knew that Phyllis and Sharon had made enemies over the years, but no one could figure out who would want to hurt them in this way. Nick was beside himself with worry. His mind raced, unable to comprehend why anyone would want to target his mother, Phyllis. His thoughts turned to recent events. Had Phyllis been involved in something she hadn't told him about? And what about Sharon? She was always trying to do the right thing, always so caring. Why would someone want to hurt them both? Ray, too, felt the pressure mounting. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that this kidnapping was personal. Whoever had done this wasn't just out for money or revenge, they had a vendetta. But what was it? The two men worked together, piecing together the clues, but they were no closer to finding the answers they so desperately needed. Chapter 4. The Shocking Reveal. Back in the warehouse, Phyllis and Sharon were growing more desperate by the minute. They had tried everything to break free from their restraints, but nothing worked. Sharon's thoughts were clouded with fear and confusion, but Phyllis refused to give in to panic. She was determined to escape, to get back to her son, to her life. But then, just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the door creaked open once again. This time, however, it wasn't the same masked figure. The person who entered the room wasn't wearing a mask. Instead, they stood before Phyllis and Sharon, their face both familiar and terrifying. It was Nikki Newman. Phyllis and Sharon stared at her in disbelief. Nikki was the last person they expected to see, especially in such a situation. "Nikki, what are you doing here?" Sharon gasped, her voice full of confusion. Nikki stood in the doorway, her eyes cold and distant. She didn't answer right away, instead pacing back and forth. "You two have no idea, do you? You've been blind to everything happening around you." Phyllis, always sharp, furrowed her brows. "What the hell are you talking about?" Nikki stopped pacing and looked directly at them. "I didn't want to do this, but you left me no choice. You both ruined my family, my life, and now, it's time for payback." Sharon shook her head in disbelief. "Nikki, we've always been friends. We've always tried to support each other. What is this about?" Nikki let out a bitter laugh. "Friends? You think you've been friends? You've both been a thorn in my side for years. Phyllis, you took everything from me with your schemes, and Sharon, you've always been in the way of what should have been mine. It's time to pay the price." Phyllis's mind raced as she tried to process Nikki's words. This was about more than just a simple feud. This was personal. Nikki had been harboring a deep resentment for years, and now it had finally boiled over. Chapter 5. The Plan Unravels. As Nikki stood before them, her plan unfolded like a dark and twisted masterpiece. She had orchestrated the entire kidnapping from the beginning, using her connections and knowledge of their lives to manipulate everything. She had watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, she had them exactly where she wanted them. "I'm not going to kill you," Nikki said, her voice dripping with venom. "But I'm going to make sure that both of you never see the light of day again. You'll rot here, forgotten." Phyllis and Sharon exchanged a look of horror. This was it, the end of the line. But even as Nikki's words sank in, there was a flicker of hope in their hearts. They were alive. They were still breathing. And that meant there was still a chance to escape. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Phyllis stood up, her hands still bound but her resolve unshaken. "You're not going to get away with this, Nikki. You may think you've won, but you haven't. We're getting out of here, and you're going to pay for what you've done." Nikki raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Is that so? You really think you can escape?" Sharon, too, gathered her courage. "You've made a mistake, Nikki. We'll never stop fighting." Nikki took a step back, a smirk forming on her lips. "We'll see about that." Chapter 6. The Escape. The next few hours were a blur of tension and suspense. Phyllis and Sharon, using every bit of their intelligence and strength, began working together to free themselves. They had no idea how they were going to escape, but they knew they couldn't give up. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Phyllis managed to break free from her restraints. Sharon followed suit, and together, they took the fight to Nikki. It wasn't long before the authorities arrived, having traced the location of the warehouse. With Nikki apprehended, Phyllis and Sharon were finally free. Epilogue. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the shocking news of Nikki's involvement in the kidnapping spread throughout Genoa City. No one could believe that the beloved matriarch of the Newman family could be capable of such dark deeds. But Phyllis and Sharon knew the truth. Sometimes, the most unexpected people have the darkest secrets. As Nikki was taken into custody, the town began to heal from the shock. Phyllis and Sharon, though shaken, were grateful to be alive. And as for Nikki, her betrayal would forever haunt her family and the town she once called home. But in the end, the truth had come to light. And as the sun set once again over Genoa City, life slowly began to return to normal, though, for Phyllis and Sharon, things would never be the same.